if you're basing your pay decisions off of published pay rates for your state or the country for a standard kind of job, you're really putting yourself at a disadvantage because you're not getting precise enough about what you need. You're putting yourself at a disadvantage because you could be paying at an uncompetitive rate, which means that you're not accessing talent as quickly as you need.
Welcome to the All in Recruitment podcast by Manatal, where we explore best practices, learnings, and trends with leaders in the recruitment space. If you like our content, please subscribe to our channels on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify to stay tuned for our weekly episodes. I'm your host, Lydia. This week we have Cary Sparrow, who is a founder and CEO at WageScape. Thanks for joining us, Cary.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here.
So you've 35 years of experience spanning engineering, military, consulting, and operations leadership. So how have these, very impressive, and how have these diverse experiences shaped your approach to leading WageScape or even founding it, Cary?
Well, in terms of leading it, I've had the benefit of working with a couple hundred organizations. When I was in consulting, we did lots of work with different types of companies in different types of situations. I got to see lots of different approaches. I got to work with people all over the world. I learned how to work virtually very quickly. That was one of the things that I did when I set up WageScape, was I set up a virtual organization. I founded WageScape 10 years ago. This was well before the pandemic, and deliberately set it up to be a global virtual organization. This was before remote work was even kind of a thing. My experiences leading up to that time were involved with working with global teams. We didn't really have much video conferencing, and so we had to learn how to work together very, very effectively without being face-to-face. So that was one of the things. The other thing was just creating a learning organization, recognizing that it's more important to go fast and correct than it is to get things perfect before you move forward. And I saw that both in the military, in consulting, and then when I was in the corporate world, I kind of saw the opposite of that, where in the corporate world, you're really paid to manage risk out. So you err on the side of taking a little bit longer and getting things as right as possible. But in a tech world, that will kill you. And so, had kind of a bias for action that was instilled from my other parts of my careers.
So what initially drew you to the labor market data space? I mean, that's the area in which WageScape is, right? And what gaps did you see that WageScape was created to fill?
So I had been working with companies to help them get the most out of their workforce for like 20 years, and took a very analytic approach to looking at where opportunities exist, how to link operations and organization to strategy. Took a very kind of business strategy approach to that as well. And one of the things I noticed was that the availability of data about what's happening with jobs and pay and skills, who's available, who needs, who's hiring, is really bad. It's a little bit better now than it was 10 years ago, but it's still not nearly what it could be. And so the information really gets in the way of companies, doing what they could be doing in terms of creating an environment where they can unleash the talents of their workforce to really drive competitive performance. And I saw that as a real opportunity because a lot of the root causes for why the information is so bad have been, over time, been going away with better advanced technology and changing behaviors in terms of being able to, share data across organizations, for example, having systems that do that. And so forth. So I saw kind of there's a pain point that most people just live with, which is that their information about how much to pay people, who's hiring, where to go get talent, and so forth is so out of date that most people are just flying completely blind. They think they know the market, but they don't really know what's going on in the market because there's no good information about it. And so that, coupled with the fact that now there's better sources of information that could be tapped into that hadn't been tapped into before, is what led me to found WageScape. I founded it 10 years ago, and 10 years ago, nobody was looking at real-time hiring and pay the way that we envisioned it. And we very quickly set up an operation and a technology stack that allows us to capture what's the hiring situation and the pay situation look like worldwide every single day. And in the 10 years since, other people have gotten into that business. And it's not to say that we were literally the first, but we, I think, had a vision that took it a bit further and saw the usefulness of that information in the talent acquisition space. This really came to a head in the pandemic when basically the supply chains of talent were completely fractured. What was needed for talent was being completely turned upside down because certain things you couldn't do anymore and certain things were now critical that you didn't have enough staff for. Companies started paying to get the staff, and they were paying at a really fast rate. So between like 2021 and 2022, advertised wages were going up about 25% a year, which is amazing when you think about it, because every one of us is used to wage inflation between 2 and 4% a year, especially, here in the US, but also in other parts of the world, predominantly as well. And so really caught everybody off guard. And we were sitting on top of the data that said, yes, in fact, wages are going up that much, but they're not going up that much consistently. They're going up, in some cases, they're going up many times that in certain markets or for certain jobs, and they're not going up at all in other markets and for other types of jobs. And so the need, the need that we had originally envisioned 10 years ago really came into the forefront right after the pandemic. And that's when people started really beginning to invest in what's going on in real time with labor market intelligence.
So how do you find the scenario now post-pandemic?
Well, it's interesting because there's several different aspects when you say this scenario. In terms of the labor market itself, things have settled down. We're not seeing the same kind of wage inflation. But one of the things that really became apparent that was probably true all along, but now we've got the means to see it, is that there is no one labor market. So everything is local. The labor conditions locally can be materially different than the conditions even in a metro area just a couple hours away, or between what's happening within a city versus what's happening in a more rural area, even within 50 miles of each other. So everything is, there's material differences based on your location, and there's material differences based on the kind of jobs that you're looking at. And even within the same kind of job, there are material differences between the requirements for certain kinds of skills. For example, a lot of people know that the demand for long-haul truckers went up pretty dramatically over the last several years. And you see that in the hiring data, right? You see that in the hiring and the pay data. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is over the last couple of years, if you look, the median advertised pay for truckers has flattened out over the last 2 years. But the average pay has continued to go up. And the reason is because there are certain skills for truckers that are so in demand that they command much higher pay. And that's driving kind of the overall average. And so even within a job, you've got to kind of understand which skills are in demand. And all of this is important because within talent acquisition, if you're basing your pay decisions off of published pay rates for your state or the country for a standard kind of job, you're really putting yourself at a disadvantage because you're not getting precise enough about what you need. You're putting yourself at a disadvantage because you could be paying at an uncompetitive rate, which means that you're not accessing talent as quickly as you need, and you're definitely not getting the quality of talent because candidates know what's out there too. They probably know it better than most companies. The other way you could be disadvantaging yourself is the opposite, which is you could be paying too much if you're going on an average rate and you're hiring in relatively low cost areas, or if your skills requirements aren't nearly as demanding as what some other skills are, you could be paying too much. And in today's environment, especially with inflation, cost pressures are still very high. Uncertainty around the economy, especially in 2025, are causing folks to really take a close look at costs. You don't want to be paying too much, and you also don't want to be paying too little. So that's some of what's going on in the labor market itself. Companies are responding to that, though. They are changing the way that they manage pay. They're changing kind of their information sources to stay on top of things. They're paying much more close attention to who their actual competitors are. So there's lots of, the traditional kind of approach around competitive analysis for any area within a company prior to just a few years ago was to look at who the business competitors were. And in most cases, if you ask somebody, who do you compete for your talent, they would list their business competitors and they would list a handful of companies. Even in a specific metro, there are dozens and in some cases hundreds of companies that are competing for exactly the same talent as you are. And also because wages now, lower end wages have come up so much that if you're in a business that is intensive in terms of hourly workforce, who you're competing with just got a lot bigger because most folks, if they're making even a modest wage, will look very closely now at moving to another organization, even if it's a different job. If it's nearby and it pays a couple $100 more a month, then that's enough to bring people away. And the people that manage large hourly workforces know this firsthand. So they're getting more sophisticated about how they pay attention to those things.
Well, Cary, let's talk about the technology itself. I mean, your patented AI technology, it says you collect data from 5.6 million hiring organizations across 210 countries.
That's right.
So what tech challenges did you have to overcome to build this kind of data infrastructure?
So it was really neat because when I went to college, I studied for computer engineering and I love designing computer systems and thinking through problems that computers could solve. And then I went into several different careers that you mentioned where I didn't have to do that anymore. And then when I founded WageScape, we actually built our own technology to go out and get data from millions of different sources. It's operating at scale. What we started doing, and we do more than this now, was we started off by going out to every website we could find that posted job openings. And we had a special way that we had come up with to figure out what those openings were going to get paid. And so that was very useful. And then we just run that 24/7. So we just go everywhere we can find jobs and we capture that information and we update our picture of the entire world every single day. It's a 24/7 operation. Very large scale, very large amounts of data that we're dealing with. We had to learn how to scale that. We had to learn how to build in operational controls. We had to learn a lot of things. My academic background included some research in artificial intelligence. So I was able to look and say, where can we apply AI to help with how we process data? So, there's some areas where...
This was 10 years ago.
Yeah, so it was, and we still use AI a bit today, not as much as people think we do, but we still use it to do things like translate languages, translate job titles, interpret from job listings what industry the hiring organization is in, map to some standard, occupational codes, things like that. AI is particularly well suited for, so we do that.
So now, Cary, let's discuss flying blind that you mentioned earlier, right? When companies make hiring and compensation decisions, what does this actually look like for a company when they make those decisions? I mean, what critical information is what are they missing?
Yeah. So traditionally, when you talk to recruiters, you talk to hiring managers, operations leaders, and so forth, most of them would tell you that it's their job to understand the market for talent and they feel like they have a pretty good handle on it. And then you ask the next question to say, okay, what's that based on? It's like, well, I talk to X number of people every day, or I know my competitors, or I know what it takes to hire people. And when you peel it back, really what you're talking about is anecdotes. You're talking about anecdotes that have shaped people's perception so that it influences their sense of what's going on. But it's not based on any, statistically meaningful fact base. The way that pay levels are set, the way that sources of talent are targeted, the way that positions are defined, actually doesn't take into account any meaningful view of what's actually going on in the market. It's based on conventional wisdom. It's based on individual experience, which is very limited and not that useful in a very dynamic environment. This really became clear in the pandemic when you could read news articles in the same day or even in the morning of the same day. And some people were saying we were in a recession. Some people were saying we're going gangbusters. Some people were saying there's no talent. Other people were saying we have too much talent. And when you looked at what people were saying, and then you compared that with data like from us, there was no bearing to reality. And so those kinds of anecdotes, though, carry the day in actual conversations around how do we set pay levels? How do we go about recruiting? What messages will resonate with folks that are out there? Should we look at remote versus looking just where we have operations? Those kinds of things. It's those conventional wisdom and personal experience points of view that carry the day. Right. So when I say a lot of companies were flying blind, it's because they were going off of an accumulated set of experiences that were no longer relevant or were not connected to any kind of fact base about what's going on in the labor market. Savvy organizations have begun changing that. Savvy organizations recognized a few years ago that they need to equip hiring managers and recruiters with up-to-minute view of what's happening in the labor market, and they need to be proactive about how they shape their hiring practices and their pay practices and policies. And so there's a big gap, I would say, between the folks that have really embraced the idea of the labor market is dynamic. We need to be on top of exactly what's going on in order to be as effective and competitive as we need to be, and everyone else. And that gap is, more and more people are kind of adopting that view, but we're still in very early days, and it's the most savvy organizations that take that perspective.
How would you define a savvy organization?
Well, in the context of what we're talking about here, it's organizationally recognizing that they have to themselves create the capability to understand what's going on. They themselves have to constantly evaluate what do we need in order to compete from a talent standpoint. Then where can we go and get that? They have to be using actual fact-based information on what should we be paying people, what's worth paying for, what's not, and they need to operate at a much faster kind of cycle rate. So annual pay reviews do not cut it anymore. National pay reviews or international, and definitely international pay reviews don't cut it anymore. Things need to be much more localized and they need to be much more frequent. And so savvy organizations are making those changes. They're creating much more dynamic approaches to match the dynamism of the labor market.
Now, going into the actual competitive advantages, what are those competitive advantages that your clients may have gained having more accurate and timely labor market intelligence?
So I would say speed, cost, and resonance. And so speed means you can react to changes in the markets that you operate in much faster. Those changes could be driven, for example, by, like, we have one client that's a very, very large retailer that pays attention to the hiring practices of every other retailer, large and small, in every market that they operate in. And they use our data in order to do that because that's the scale that we track at. And as soon as they see a pay change with any one of those competitors, and these are competitors for talent, they're not just competitors from a business standpoint, they immediately alert the local teams, this company has made this kind of change, and they need to evaluate how to respond to it. In some cases, they don't need to respond to it. In other cases, they begin to make a shift in order to move in that direction, but they do it very, very quickly. So within a matter of days, they're able to flex kind of their local pay approach. So that's an example of speed. Having real-time information allows you to more quickly determine what matters to me and my team, and then take action on it. In order to do that, by the way, you have to have an aligned organization that understands, okay, this is, this information is what we need to pay attention to. So speed is one thing. Cost is another. I just mentioned that having a handle on what prevailing rates are in the marketplace and what's driving those prevailing rates is essential to stay competitive, not just from a talent acquisition standpoint, but from a cost management standpoint. I'll go back to the driver example that I just used. So 2022, all the major companies that were hiring long-haul truckers were increasing their advertised pay rates by more than 5% a year. In a lot of cases, much more than that. Starting in 2023 and then continuing into 2024, you started to see a number of those same companies not raising their advertised rates. And then by 2023, 2024, you're starting to see those same companies decreasing their advertised rates for drivers. So instead of everybody across the board raising rates to attract talent, now folks were taking a much more nuanced view. When you did the same analysis looking at individual locations, you saw the same thing. In certain markets, well, across all markets 3 years ago, rates were going up across the board. Now it's a much more nuanced view where rates are going down in some markets, staying the same in some markets, and going up in other markets. And this is a direct result of just having a better sense of what's that right equilibrium point for right now that is appropriate to pay this critical talent. And then, go ahead.
With data like this, Cary, how far can you forecast? If things are changing so fast, and what's the furthest you can look?
So there's certain questions that you can look reasonably far out. There's other questions where the horizon is like maybe a quarter. If you want to know where pay is going in a certain market, real-time view of what's being advertised by all the competitors in that market will show you what pay rates are going to be probably 6 to 9 months out, because it takes a while for people to come into an organization. You got to hire people, you got to get them on board, you got to pay them, and so forth. And so, like 6 to 9 months is a reasonable kind of forecasting ability. Keep in mind, though, that that's compared to zero using prior methods, prior data sources. You couldn't really reasonably predict anything at a local level or at a job level based on prior sources. It was just not nearly precise enough. There are other applications, though, where you can predict even further out. I mean, one of the things we saw coming out of the pandemic was we saw very clearly who was starting to hire again in certain industries right away, which companies were going to be more resilient coming out of the pandemic because they started to loosen up hiring much earlier. And we knew which ones were really struggling because they didn't. They had hiring freeze. Their hiring went to zero effectively. And that had long-term implications. And so there's a whole other use of, from a competitive intelligence standpoint, there's lots of uses for this kind of information too.
Cary, one more question about AI. And, in terms of the impact of advancing AI technologies and recruitment, have you noticed that sort of impact happening on the recruiter side or even the candidate side? Because we've seen more and more scenarios in which candidates are using AI and so are recruiters, but yet they've not really understood how advanced or how to really manage the capabilities that are coming out of AI. So what are your views on that?
I mean, you can't have a conversation these days about talent acquisition without talking about AI. In fact, you can't have a conversation about business without talking about AI, and it's changing so fast. I think one of the things to recognize is that the world today is not what the world in 6 months is going to be when it comes from AI. And so talent acquisition teams have to be very diligent to recognize that capabilities that they don't think AI is suitable for now, 6 months from now, they may be suitable for. A year from now, there's definitely going to be more things that are suitable. There's a couple of, I think you're exactly right to call out both the recruiter experience and the candidate, the job seeker experience. On the job seeker side, it's important to recognize every recruiter is probably facing this right now, is job seekers are using AI tools basically as really smart search capabilities. And so when it comes to understanding what a company's culture is like, what a job entails, how much they should be getting paid, they're going to AI models to tell them that. And those AI models, even though they say answers with high authority and with great detail, they are in many cases just flat out wrong. So as an interesting exercise, anyone listening out there, if you want to do this, go out and look at the top 3 AI models that are available for free and ask them what the pay rate is for just pick a position. And you're going to get 3 wildly different answers. And that's because they're not learning based on any reasonable or up-to-date fact base. In most cases, you'd have no idea how old those rates are, from what they're quoting. So there's a lot of inaccuracies, but the job seekers don't care about that. As far as they know, that's the right answer. So you have to equip yourself in order to re-level everybody with, this is the situation, this is our understanding of kind of what's going on, and this is why we offer this kind of offer. And it is useful to stay on top of what our AI is telling people. So you can bring in additional information to bear with that. So there's this whole question that I get into with audiences sometimes, like, what is truth in the world with AI? And unless you let it, truth is going to be defined by the AI. So at some point, it doesn't matter what truth really is. If the AI is something different, then kind of perception is reality from that standpoint. So you got to stay on top of that as a recruiter. The other thing is there's lots of tools that are available to recruiters now. For over 10 years, companies have invested in AI matching of candidates to job requirements as a way to improve fit and streamline the recruiting process. And those have had very mixed results, I would say. Every 3 years, a new crop of companies comes out to do that. And there will continue to be more that do that. But from what I'm seeing, a relatively superficial approach at what good fit is going to be. So they'll start looking at position requirements and see who are the folks that have the best match with those position requirements. Then the latest generation of tools starts looking at skills to say what are the underlying skills required in certain types of work and who's got the best match for those skills. And AI is playing a role to suss out what skills are relevant. But there's a whole dimension to things which has to do with the way organizations work, that has to do with culture, it has to do with working style, work ethic, and so forth, that AI is not touching. And so from a recruiter standpoint, you can't just abdicate everything to the results of an AI-driven search. You really still have to know what allows people to thrive and succeed in your organization and what's going to set them up to fail. And in most cases, that's not just a skills fit. That has everything to do with an organizational fit.
And final question, Cary, what advice would you give someone who is starting a career in this talent space? I mean, this nuanced, dynamic talent space that we just talked about today.
Yeah, a couple things. And some of it is just like bread and butter, right? So work hard, put yourself in a position to learn the most you can from the people around you, put yourself in organizations that are in that kind of savvy organization category that bring a pretty aggressive and nuanced view of what's going on in the labor market. That's the biggest thing, is choose your spot and work hard and learn as much as possible. If you're already in talent acquisition, guard against conventional wisdom and traditional ways of doing things, because things are changing so rapidly. New technologies are coming online and labor conditions are changing so much.
Mm-hmm.
If you're relying on the way that things have been done in the past, I think you're setting yourself up to really be uncompetitive.
Well, thank you very much for your time and your insights today, Cary. So for those who are listening in, where can they find you?
Sure. Anyone listening in, thank you, first of all. And you can find us online at WageScape.com. You can find me and WageScape on LinkedIn. And if you want to reach out to us and you mentioned this podcast, we have ways to accommodate you if you find a way to kind of do business together. So thanks again.
Thanks again, Cary. We have been in conversation with Cary Sparrow, CEO of WageScape. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more weekly episodes from All in Recruitment on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify.